The prince in shining armor is an archetype that doesn't show up in all stories. Honestly, the princely archetype mostly reminds me of shoujo anime like Revolutionary Girl Utena, or maybe even Fruits Baskets to some extent, or other media made with primarily women in mind. The prince character who's equal parts charming and duty-bound to protect what's important to them. The princely character who would give anything to save those in need. The princely character that's maybe a bit whimsical and definitely a romantic at heart. All of this describes Wyll Ravengard pretty much perfectly. However, there is more to his character than just this princely archetype. While yes, the majority of his character and his characteristics are built around this archetype, there's some things to unpack here, so that's what I wanted to do today. Wyll is a very powerful character who also just has a really sick intro if you're not playing his origin.
Damnable roach!
That one goblin lady looked kind of pretty.
Provoke the blade and suffer its sting.
Why is Wyll so cool? We actually have to get him on our party this time. I don't care if you think that's cheesy or lame, it goes hard and it's pretty reminiscent of corny badass shonen anime guys, so I'm vibing with it. So who exactly is Wyll Ravengard?
7 years ago, I was exiled from Baldur's Gate, the city I call home. My name is Wyll, but the people of the Sword Coast call me the Blade of Frontiers, champion of the meek, defender of the innocent. The truth isn't quite so simple, but they're right about one thing. I hunt monsters, and I always catch my prey.
Wyll Ravengard is the Blade of Frontiers. He's a man who has sacrificed everything just to help others, but he does not regret it. If he had to, he would do it all again in a heartbeat. He would make the same decisions every time if it meant helping those in need. All it cost was the price of his soul and losing his father and a place to call home. He's a little bit of a stereotypical D&D character, especially a person's first character, in the sense that he's a self-sacrificing hero who also has daddy issues. The tragic past that doesn't stain how he views the world, the seemingly cardboard cutout of what we all think a hero should be like. Some people noticed this about his character fairly early on and used that against him, which I think is a little bit unfair because those are still stories worth telling. Just because he is standard in some ways does not make his character any less interesting or well executed. And speaking on execution, yes, I am painfully aware that Wyll's character is a bit fumbled. He doesn't have as much content as the rest of the Origin companions, and in a lot of ways he feels very sidelined. I did write this part of the script before patch 6 dropped, so glad to see that nothing has changed. That was sarcasm, by the way. I mean, Wyll's own character arc quest isn't even about himself like the others are, but that does not discount what we do have. And in a way, I think it goes to show just how Wyll is like as a character and his characteristics and the things that he values. And it does add a little bit to what the game is building up. And I will explain because, yes, it's sad, it's terrible, it's frustrating that Wyll's character is reduced to just the people around him and he doesn't get to go on an arc of his own. And he is a character that I really adore, and I wish he got the same treatment and love that the rest of the companions got. But that's beside the point. I don't want to spend that much time complaining about it in this video because I want to take a look at what we do have and the characters, or the characteristics that we can pick up based on what we do have in the game. Anyway, Wyll is great, and he's a character that I found myself stumbling into his romance because his morals were pretty similar to mine and the character I was playing as on that particular playthrough. And while it may not have been something that I was intending to do, and my love for Wyll is not as unhealthily brain-consuming as my love for Astarion, I found myself falling for his character and growing to love Wyll Ravengard a lot. So if you're on the fence about him, I ask that you set aside any preconceived notions you may have about Wyll and come with me on the journey of exploring his character. As you begin Act 1 of the game, you'll find yourself walking somewhere along the Sword Coast. After a bit of exploring and maybe even building your party already, you'll stumble across a grove hidden in the wilderness. A group of adventurers running away from goblins show up, and the goblins are not far behind them. It is up to you, the adventurers, and the tieflings atop the gate to fend off the goblins and protect the grove. Amongst those inside the grove, though, is a man who jumps out with a fun catchphrase and a desire to protect. As you fight alongside him and the others against the goblins, you can see what he's made of. After fighting off the wave of goblins, you're allowed inside the gate, where you can find that same man, Wyll, teaching children how to sword fight. This is where you can actually introduce yourself to him and begin the process of adding Wyll to your adventuring party. When you speak with him, your tadpoles connect, and that's how you learn that Wyll is also suffering the same affliction as you. However, he's got more pressing matters. I need all the friends I can
Better
get.
friends than the ones hitching a ride in our skulls, at least.
He's
I'm
so
sure you
real
know
for
the
that.
stories. Doomed to shed our skin and become illithid. They say there's no coming back. But we haven't sprouted any tentacles. Not yet, anyway.
He's so chill
Could just
about
be good
this.
luck. I'm not so...
Your minds collide once more. Wyll chases the fiend ignited with rancor. She is an infernal war devil. A threat to the living. Evil incarnate.
Shit! You saw her.
Saw who?
Advocatus Diaboli.
I don't know who you are talking about. He is duty-bound to hunting down a devil, one that you can help him eliminate. He describes her as bloodthirsty and dangerous, and he seems genuinely upset at the idea of what terror she could be inflicting on innocent people. Now, we could take a moment to mourn the fact that Wyll's introduction is more about Karlach than it is himself, but it also kind of shows that Wyll is a bleeding heart hero. Someone who tries to help or save everyone, even at the detriment of himself, which you can see with how he encourages the kids as you first walk up to him and does his best to teach them how to buy time in case of a goblin invasion. And he is more concerned with helping the tieflings and hunting down Karlach to reduce the damage that he thinks that she'll do than he is towards working towards a cure. His number one priority is helping people and taking down Karlach so she doesn't put others at risk. Never mind the fact that he too is at risk. He doesn't care about that. And while that could be chalked up to an inconsistency in writing and just Wyll being sidelined in his own story, I would rather look at that as characterization for Wyll being self-sacrificial in a way, especially because things that are explicitly stated and written in his story supports the claims of him being self-sacrificial. It's honestly kind of funny though how after the Nautiloid crash, Wyll just dusts himself off and heads over to the Grove, becoming a part of their community. It is possible he may have met the tieflings before, but he's kind of just hanging out and ignoring the tadpole in his brain, and you know what? He is so real for that. Avoidance of a crisis is very relatable. And besides, his loyalty to his mission from his patron is more pressing to him, so I get it. Although at this point in time, you don't know he's a warlock with the patron and that the mission came from his patron. I mean, it's pretty obvious he's a warlock because he's wearing the same base armor that the player would get if you played as a warlock yourself. And if you're just familiar with what warlocks can do, then it's very obvious. It's kind of like Astarion, where it's the world's worst kept secret. If you take Wyll up on his quest to hunt down Karlach, you're able to add him to your party or ask him to wait at camp. He will not be willing to join your adventure if you're not willing to help him out on his quest, though. I will say, it's not necessary to take Wyll to see Karlach, but it could free up a spot in your long rest cutscene queue if you're waiting for something else. The confrontation plays out pretty much the same on Wyll's end either way, so it's really up to you if you'd rather have this conversation during the long rest, after picking up Karlach, or when you go to pick up Karlach initially.
Karlach, the archdevil Zariel's gladiator. come to burn the Sword Coast to ash.
Karlach's just having a good time.
Not counting the fuckers that need a good hurting.
You're not helping.
Shut it, devil. I know your kind. A heart darker than a shadow's nightmares. You'd cut a child's throat just to taste the blood.
Karlach will explain who she is, using the tadpole to help explain that she was a victim of Zariel and forced to fight on the front lines of the Blood Wars. After a bit of back and forth, Wyll eventually realizes that Karlach is not the devil he was led to believe. He almost pleads with the player that we don't know what we're asking him to do, desperation on his face and in his voice, and to me, it is increasingly clear that he knows he's wrong about Karlach, and that she's not dangerous and she's not a devil that needs to be eliminated. But accepting that fact and changing his course of actions is going to cause a great deal of pain for him.
Catches his breath and his lips straighten. Sheer dread twists his face.
No! Devils cannot be trusted! You don't know what this means. You don't know what you're asking me to do. Shit! Shit. You really are no devil, are you?
But once Wyll sees that truth, he cannot ignore it. He makes the choice to suffer whatever consequences await him because he cannot, in good faith, murder an innocent person, a victim even, someone who has done nothing to deserve an unjust death. He folds relatively quickly, considering how strongly he felt about getting rid of Karlach before. Wyll is more than willing to accept when he's wrong and adjust when he learns differently, and I honestly really respect that. That was one of the first things that I saw from his character, and decided that he was going to be one of my favorites. Also, just by the time I met Wyll, I already knew that most of the companions were pretty cool in their own rights, so there's also that.
You've been witness to a pantomime, I'm sorry to say. And I've played my part all too poorly.
Wyll is quick to apologize, and he does his best to explain as much as he can. I also find it shows a lot about his character. He's not only sorry for how he spoke to Karlach, but also apologizes for having believed differently. This man literally apologizes for being lied to, pretty much. And while I appreciate the sentiment, it's wild that he feels the need to specifically apologize for being lied to. But at the same time, he is taking responsibility for the actions and the words that came directly from him. He's taking responsibility for believing the lies at face value and not doing anything to learn more. And you know what? That's fair. Wyll cannot go into much detail about why he needed to kill Karlach and what punishment awaits him, but he does assure the player that they and the rest of camp will be totally fine. It will only be his burden to bear. Luckily for us, though, not long after this encounter, we get to see exactly what's going on. If you couldn't tell by now, Wyll is in fact a warlock, and oh boy, do we get to meet his patron.
You've been naughty, and you know what happens when you're naughty.
Wyll has sold his soul to the devil Mazora. I guess she's technically a Cambion. It's close enough. He sold his soul to Mazora in exchange for power. The exact situation as to how they become contracted is sworn to secrecy due to the contract, so for now, it's a mystery. Mazora shows up to camp, antagonizing Wyll, teasing him even. He argues that killing Karlach goes against everything he agreed to when making the contract. He'd only hunt devils and the heartless. Karlach is neither of those things. Mazora, though, insists that Karlach meets the criteria on a technicality, and that's pretty much how Mazora works. Everything is on a technicality with her as long as she can get what she wants. Wyll failed to complete the mission, and now he must suffer the consequences of disobeying his patron.
But a defiant pup must still pay his price. To wit.
Wyll did nothing wrong. And I stand by that.
Wyll burns in the fires of Avernus. The lightning storms of Dis strike his flesh. His soul passes through each layer of the hells, gaining their essence and their torment.
Damn. That's crazy. Mizora turns him into a devil, effectively stripping him of his humanity, or his perceived humanity. But Wyll presses on. After this encounter, the player has a chance to ask Wyll more about himself, and he does his best to answer what he can.
The one little question that put me out of house and home. I can't utter the terms or circumstances of the pact. I can tell you most all else, but the pact, I'm forbidden, unless Mizora permits it. But I'll say this. The moment I pacted myself to Mizora, I have not regretted for a heartbeat. It was my proudest deed.
Wyll did what he could to protect others and the place he called home, and despite losing his freedom, sacrificing his soul to Mizora, Wyll does not regret a thing. He'd make the same decision every time. Wyll is truly a self-sacrificial hero. Okay, I know a lot of people may not vibe with the self-sacrificial hero trope, but it goes a long way to characterize someone. Wyll may not be a people pleaser in the traditional sense. His main motivation is not keeping the peace or trying to avoid confrontation. His main motivation is to help and protect, but he goes about it in a way that can be relatable with people pleasers, sacrificing himself for the sake of others. He's not a people pleaser, but he has tendencies that those who struggle with being a people pleaser in the real world can relate to. Now a devil, Wyll has to grapple with dysphoria as well. And this can be seen more so at the tiefling party than any other point in the game, where he's ashamed to be seen by the tieflings from the grove and is spending his night on the beach, brooding pretty much.
Ah, hells. I was hoping you wouldn't notice I was gone.
He spent 24 years living as a human in a normal human body, and now all of a sudden he has horns and bumps and ridges all over his body. The body he now resides in is not his own, and it's not the body that best represents who he is on the inside. After he is turned, the player can ask him about it and ask how it feels, and he talks about having to get used to the new feeling of this new body and the discomfort that comes along with it. He's very insecure in his new form and worried about what others will think of him. He is no devil at heart, but the people of Faerun generally fear, mistrust, or feel discomfort towards devils and tieflings, assuming that a person who looks of the hells would not be a safe person to be around. It sucks, and this is now what Wyll has to face and grapple with. Luckily, though, for the most part, the fantasy racism in Baldur's Gate 3 is mostly just microaggressions and wildly hostile dialogue every once in a while, but it does still suck, and can be a bit off-putting for the player, especially a player that may have to deal with that sort of behavior in real life as well. There's no escapism allowed for people who have to suffer microaggressions and racism in real life, apparently. While it was likely not intended as a transgender allegory, and Wyll does seem to eventually get used to his new form, and pretty quickly at that, his feelings of shame and disconnect from his new body are very reminiscent to how many trans people feel about their own bodies before transitioning. The only difference is it wasn't a sudden change causing the issue for trans people. But I do think it's really interesting how he kind of parallels that experience. With Wyll, there's so many snippets of little things thrown into his character that honestly are really fascinating. Another way of looking at this transformation for Wyll is it's honestly a mild case of body horror. His body is ripped apart and transformed before his own eyes, although it's not literally ripped apart, but I imagine it felt pretty bad. I don't think it's fair to judge Wyll either for how he handles this aspect of his character. Yes, he's moody and in his feelings about it when it's objectively not the worst thing he is fated with on this journey, but that doesn't take away from the horror of his body being permanently transformed before his eyes without his consent at that. Generally, the brooding session at the tiefling party is not long after Wyll gets turned into a devil, and can very well be the first time since transforming that he is around people who would have known he was once human. Wyll feels shame and discomfort at the idea of the tiefling seeing what has become of him. He's almost rudely self-deprecating about his new devilish features. Rude in the sense that him sharing this new shame and frustration with a tiefling is wild, considering the stuff he's negatively talking about are just normal tiefling characteristics. but he's speaking more of his anguish and the horror that he's going through. In a lot of ways, it's a parallel to Astarion being turned into a vampire. Like, yes, the transformation is a direct result of decisions the both of them made, but at the same time, for both of these characters, it was more than they signed up for. Astarion talks about the horrific process of being turned and how much it hurt, how much it felt like his body was no longer his own, and how that affected him mentally and emotionally. Yes, I know it's a bit of a messy allegory since Cazador created an environment where Astarion's body quite literally was not his own, but that's not too different from how Mizora treats Wyll, which is bad in case that needed to be said. I'll be the first to acknowledge that Mizora is hot. She's very attractive. Her voice, stellar. But she treats Wyll like a pet and not a person. And it's not in the kinky way either, although I'm fairly certain that is an area of fan service that she is providing for a lot of people. When you actually look at the way Wyll is treated, she talks down to him and treats him as if he were nothing more than a stray dog that she took in. But she doesn't even treat him with the care and kindness most people treat their pets, human or otherwise. Wyll is a creature that's solely there for Mizora's entertainment, a creature to use as she wants. Like a little Tamagotchi that you never became emotionally attached to, but you still like to play with it because it's fun. So we've got this handsome warlock who is now turned into a devil by his cruel patron. But Wyll has more ingredients to his story than just that. If the party ventures up to the burning building, Joaquin's Rest, you will find Floric, the current advisor to the Archduke in Baldur's Gate. She also knows Wyll, or, well, knew him as a kid.
Are you all right?
Wyll, by the main god, what's become of you?
This is how you find out that Wyll's father is the Archduke Wyll Ravengard, and Daddy Ravengard needs rescuing. Archduke Ravengard has been kidnapped by the Absolute Cult, so this probably ties into the main plot somehow. Some of the dialogue options that the player can pick when talking with Wyll about this shows that the people of Baldur's Gate either didn't know or had forgotten that Wyll ever existed. Or they might have known he existed, but just thought he left the city and no other details are known, which, to be fair, yeah, that makes sense that the general public would know so little. If you pick the latter option, Wyll shares that he and his father used to be close until he was exiled, and he can't explain more due to the pact with Mizora.
You heard right. My father and I were close once upon a time, until he disowned me and cast me out of Baldur's Gate.
I also find it interesting to note that if you have Wyll on your party when you do this, Floric will speak with him directly, expressing shock and a hint of sadness for what has happened to him, if he's a devil at this point at least. And she'll go on to say that he must hold little love for his father, even though that cannot be farther from the truth for this man who so deeply cares. But part of Floric feels that she has to plead and bargain with Wyll to help his father. But I do understand where she is coming from, because Wyll was cast out by his father, and I think most people would feel some type of way about that. And whatever love that they felt towards their parent would sour because of the cruel treatment of being shunned and cast away for becoming a warlock, essentially. Throughout the rest of Act 1, Wyll does not have a whole lot going on. His Act 1 romance scene, if you are romancing him, is basically just speaking with him and eventually kissing him on the beach at the tiefling party, and it's not necessary to lock in his romance. It's not a special cutscene like the other characters, which is honestly pretty sad. It's literally just his party dialogue. You get the same dialogue if you're romancing him or not. The only difference is you're probably not going to pick the option to kiss him. Act 1 for Wyll is basically just getting all of the dolls together that the game is going to utilize in acting out the rest of the story. And not even specifically just Wyll's story, because the only thing that is tied directly to Wyll is Mizora. You can go find Karlach without having Wyll. You can go save Wyll Ravengard without having Wyll. The only thing that is locked in with Wyll specifically is Mizora, and you don't even have to adventure with him to progress that storyline, whereas a lot of the other companions, you actually have to take them places and do things with them to learn about their story and to do that. And a lot of the aspects of their story are going to be locked to their character, like the Gauntlet of Shar and Shadowheart. Although, I guess technically you don't have to take Shadowheart to that, but it just makes sense to. Makes sense. Maybe I can just disregard everything I just said. The game doesn't force you to take certain characters' places, it just pushes you to do so. But Wyll doesn't have that, like, pushing of, hey, you might want to take Wyll here, like it does with pretty much all the other characters. Also, Wyll doesn't get upset if you leave him out of his own stuff. Like, Karlach will be a little upset if you go kill the paladins without her, and Lae'zel will be a little upset if you don't really, like, do the creche with her. But Wyll, if you do all of Wyll's stuff without him, he's just chillin'. Early into Act 2, Mizora shows up at camp again, giving Wyll a new mission. He must save one of Zariel's assets from Moonrise Towers. A stark difference from the usual slaying of monsters he's usually tasked with, but one he begrudgingly agrees to. However, the player has the chance to bargain in Wyll's favor.
Mizora's words may be flippant, but they are tinged with desperation. She cannot afford for Wyll to fail this mission. This may be your best chance to negotiate Wyll out of his pact.
I know what we have to do.
Oh, and what condition is that?
Your mind links with Wyll's, drawn in by his increasing panic.
What are you doing?
A doubtful Wyll catches his breath, but says nothing. And your connection.
I wonder what the asset is. Yeah, I don't know. Don't know.
Now,
I do know,
why
but
should I
we'll
go
pretend that we
letting my
don't.
favorite pet off his leash?
Say you know a pact-breaking charm and a chant is no. Well, I would rather intimidate her, actually. Just in case. Okay, we can work with this. We didn't fail it.
Incredible. You actually think you hold the winning hand?
I'm maybe.
I'll play your game. But I amend the pact once the mission's done, not before.
Through an insight check, the player can learn that Mizora is desperate for Wyll to take this mission, and that can be used to the player and Wyll's advantage. So we make a deal. Wyll completes the mission, and Mizora severs the pact, freeing Wyll's soul once more, and granting him the peace of mind that comes with it. The ability to be his own person, and the distance that he needs from the cruel likes of Mizora. It's a glimmer of hope for Wyll, and it's one that he deserves. As you continue through Act 2, Wyll takes a sideline for Shadowheart and is mostly just chilling until the finale, but it's nice that you were able to work this out for him. I do think it's interesting that this is something that the two of you have not really spoken about before. You can basically, like, reassure him after he gets turned into a devil that, hey, you should really get out of this pact. Maybe there's a way to do it, but that's kind of the end of it. He never brings it up again. He never talks about it again. And it honestly feels like the player is pushing him to do so. I do agree that it is the good thing for him to seek out, but I think it's wild. The player has to literally push him into doing it. It is all the player's doing, pretty much. While you wait to take Wyll to the finale or finish his quest stuff at the finale, some point during Act 2, if you are romancing him, you get a really cute cutscene. Wait! When I said we were romancing Wyll instead, I didn't think it would happen so quickly. Wyll's romance is interesting because I believe it does go a long way to characterize him, but it's not tied to his personal quest line or character arc like the other companions. It almost exists within a vacuum where you can forget about the monstrosities that the two of you have been going through and just live in a cute rom-com or a shoujo romance where none of these issues are a thing. You can forget about Mizora, you can forget about his father, you can forget about the tadpole. The Act 2 romance scene is where you pretty much lock in or lock out of Wyll's romance. and for some who may not have been planning on romancing him from the start, this might be your first romance encounter with him. Unless you count flirting with him and telling him that he's handsome in Act 1, but I do that all the time. I do that anyway. In previous dialogue, when asking about Wyll's life, you can learn that Wyll used to go to parties in Baldur's Gate. He lived a little bit of a noble life, and that's fun. That definitely was put in to make him feel more like a prince. You can flirt with him and ask to see his dance moves, but he'll chuckle and share that he's a bit rusty, but maybe if the two of you grow close enough, he'll dance for you. To trigger his Act 2 romance scene, I believe you have to get Wyll up to max approval. I don't know if it can trigger with just having very high. It's always waited until I got him up to 100 to trigger. And honestly, it's really easy to get him up to max approval, even if you're not trying to go for him specifically, as long as you're playing a good aligned, kind of heroic character. And trust me on this, it's so easy, because I got Wyll up to 100 approval by early Act 2 in multiple playthroughs, where I was also farming Astarion approval, and Astarion and Wyll do not always agree on a lot of things, so sometimes Astarion approval is also Wyll disapproval, and if I can have Astarion to max approval and Wyll to max approval both in Act 2, Wyll is very easy to please, as long as you're not just downright evil. But once you get all those approval points, one night during a long rest, you will encounter Wyll dancing by the fire. It looks like the two of you have grown close enough for him to show you his moves. You can join in on the fun, showing him your most awkward dance moves. It's fun, it's cute, but honestly, I'm a bard, I aced that performance check. You'd think I'd have a bit more flow than that. But Wyll seems to find it charming. The two of you dance together, and the romance comes to a climax when he leans in for a kiss. It's sweet, gentle, and very much your wholesome fairy tale romance. Wyll comments on how he prefers to do things in a more traditional way, despite you making him forget himself. He's courteous and also waiting for marriage, I think? Or at the very least, Wyll does not put out on the first date, which, fair enough. Whatever your preferences are, man, just as long as everyone is comfortable. Wyll's romance is honestly pretty great for anyone who may be a bit sex-averse or just not comfortable seeing a lot of sexuality in video games, but also, if you're not comfortable with a lot of sexuality in video games, Baldur's Gate 3 may not be the game for you. Respectfully. Respectfully. Sometimes you stumble into things. But no, I'm being a little silly. When you do not romance Wyll, you can still pick up on the princely hero vibes that his character is putting down, but the emphasis on the prince archetype is a lot more prevalent in the romance path for his character. He's kind, he's respectful, he's whimsical. Wyll's whimsy mostly comes out in his romance, and the main aspects of his character that lead to a more fairy tale description comes from the romantic aspect as well. In a way, his approach to romance is very idealistic, which makes sense because he's basically been an outcast working hard to put his powers to use, helping others along the Sword Coast since he was 17. He hasn't had a lot of adult dating experience. I don't know if he's had any dating experience at all, to be honest. He very well could have as a kid, but I feel like this fairy tale idealistic version of romance is typically only seen in children or people who have kept that childlike wonder and whimsy for the world, and I think that sums up Wyll's character pretty well in a way that may not be as obvious, especially if you're not romancing him. Wyll also seems like he was a bit sheltered as a child, and like he'd often turn to fairy tales to explore the world. Like, obviously he has since explored and experienced much, but when speaking with Wyll, he does turn to stories and fables to help get a point across. I mean, it's a good form of communication because sometimes it is easier to understand a point when being told through a story that's not exactly your situation. It gives you that distance to kind of see, maybe I should learn a lesson from this story. But I do think it is very much, like, it shows a lot about how Wyll was raised. Kids use a lot of stories to relate to the world because kids haven't had the time to experience the world. They haven't been pushed out into the world the way that adults have. And I'm not saying that Wyll is a kid, but I do think he has retained a lot of that childlike wonder and idealism that gets beaten out of a lot of people as they get older and experience more negative things, more cruelties that the world has to offer. Wyll's Act 2 comes to a climax during the final stages. After the first phase of the Ketheric fight, you and the gang get to explore the Mind Flayer colony that's underneath Moonrise. That is where you find Mizora, of all people, in a pod. She had been kidnapped and was in need of a rescue. Mizora was Zariel's asset. That's why she was so desperate earlier. After saving Mizora, she pulls some bullshit and reveals that Wyll is still bound to her for 6 months and gives Wyll the go-ahead to speak freely about how they met and the origin of their pact. But he doesn't have the time to tell you about it now. That'll have to wait until your next long rest or after you defeat Ketheric. After trekking through the colony and arriving at the place where Ketheric is waiting, the party will begin to learn the depths of the situation, and the fact that older Ravengard not only was kidnapped by the cult, but was kidnapped by the chosen of the Absolute. We watch as he becomes infected with a tadpole, being reduced to a puppet for the cult. The exact reason behind this is left unsaid for now, but Wyll is certain that nothing good can happen. Nothing good is going to come of this. His father, a person who holds so much political power, is now a puppet for the Absolute, giving the Absolute cult the same political power that older Ravengard can wield in Baldur's Gate. After defeating Ketheric, Wyll shares his concerns with what Orin and Gortash are planning. What ways will they use his father to further the cult? How will the rest of the coast suffer? Things have grown bigger than just saving his father. In fact, saving his father is only an aspect in the greater fight for Faerun. I'll be real, I don't like Wyll's father. I think Wyll's dad is not a great dad. So sometimes it kind of feels like the game is pushing us to want to save older Ravengard. So they're giving us a reason to not ignore that he needs saving and to make us care, because so far Wyll has not done a good job at making us care about his father. Not that he has to, but Wyll has such a undying love for his father when his father has not earned said undying love. Wyll respects him more than he should, and I think the vast majority of people playing the game feel that way. Feel that the respect and love are unearned, in fact, dismissed even. So, we'll talk more about that when it becomes relevant. Now that the dust has settled, though, you can finally ask Wyll about his history with Mizora. This is where we learn the full extent as to which Wyll was placed in an impossible situation and taken advantage of. He's just not gonna voice act this. If your home were under siege, what would you sacrifice to save it? Because we're playing as a Joestar, we would give our life.
As would I, and more.
One night, when Wyll's father was away, Baldur's Gate came under attack by the Cult of the Dragon.
I heard a whisper as I slept. Dusk Hawk Hill. The Queen of Chaos awakens. Go alone. I grabbed a rapier and set out. There wasn't a cloud in the sky, yet not a single star was shining. There they were, gathered at the foot of the hill.
Your head tingles. Wyll wants to show you what happened. Power to save it, she whispers.
Mizora promised Wyll the power to save his home, something he lacked but desperately needed. Wyll is the kind of guy who feels a level of responsibility when it comes to doing what he can to make the world a better place. And I imagine having your father being the Grand Duke would make those feelings of responsibility for helping and protecting your home even stronger. Wyll felt that he needed to do something, that the weight of the world had fallen onto his shoulders. Baldur's Gate depended on him. Just a 17-year-old kid whose father held a position of power. Just a kid who didn't have the means to protect his home despite his feelings of duty. And that's where Mizora came in. Promising power to protect, power to tend to his duty, and so Wyll sold his soul. A small price to pay in his eyes compared to all the destruction and death that could have followed if he didn't. Wyll sold his soul because his only other choice was watching his home become destroyed, knowing that he could have done something if he didn't value his soul and his freedom. I do believe Wyll would have seeked out being a hero if all of this had never happened. It's a part of his ideals, and one thing I've noticed about Wyll's character is that his personality and worldview are mostly unaffected by the past 7 years. He still loves his father and places value in the concept of family. He still sees the good in the world and the silver lining in his own life, despite being manipulated and walked like a dog by Mizora. I do think it fits for Wyll, though. In a way, he's a lot like Karlach. His experiences have been horrible to go through, but they do not shake his character. Wyll needs to make the most of his own shitty situation as well. If he can make the Sword Coast a better place through the power he's granted by Mizora, then the sacrifice was more than worth it to him. He tells us that he would do that again and again, and he doesn't regret it. But he was also 17. I don't know about you guys, but when I was 17, I don't think I was particularly great at making life-altering decisions. But Wyll knows what he's about. He knows that he wants to help people, and if that was the only way, then so be it. He'll do it, and he's gonna make the most of it. Because people still need saving, and he now has the power to save them. Like the rest of the companions, Wyll has a bit of things going on in Act 3. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Act 3 is just tying up loose ends, a few fun, unrelated side quests, and vibes for like 30 hours or so. However long it takes for you to play through the final act. And the main thing that's left unsolved for Wyll is the matter of his father. Wyll Ravengard, a thrall to the Absolute, has given away his position of Grand Duke to Gortash. So that was his slimy plan. Use the current figurehead to place yourself in power so that you can freely enact your dastardly plan of throwing the city into panic and terror so you can swoop in and save them. It makes so much sense. After Gortash's inauguration, we have the chance to speak with Wyll Ravengard, but he can't really speak or think freely due to the tadpole. Well, for the most part. And he also does have a brief moment of self in the presence of you and the astral prism.
This is the tadpole talking.
For a brief moment, uncertainty clouds his mind, then dissipates. The astral prism vibrates in concord.
What nonsense is this?
The prism quivers once more. Ravengard falters.
As I said, Baldur's Gate will ascend to Rill's first and only grand city.
In Wyrm's Crossing, we also come across Mizora, who has plans to make Wyll's life more difficult than it has to be. She finds enjoyment in making him suffer, and yeah, she's a demon or whatever, she's supposed to be horrible, and she is pretty great at being bad. It still sucks for Wyll, though. Mizora shows up at camp one night, like kind of right after the inauguration, with witnesses to the contract she aims to make. She gives Wyll 2 choices. What are you proposing?
A life for a life. No contract is ended without sacrifice. The cost must be paid.
She's kind of the worst.
Wyll Ravengard, a choice is before you. Option 1. I show you the way to your father. I guarantee him no harm except that from you and your allies. And you Pledge your soul to me and the Archdevil Zariel in a pact eternal. Option 2. I break your pact, and you are freed from your duty. Your father dies by his enemy's hand, and Baldur's Gate loses its greatest champion.
Break his contract, gaining his freedom, and sacrificing his father for it, or get the information from Azora for how to save his father and stay tied to her forever, with a clause specifically stating that there will be no way out of the new contract, effectively making this a forever situation. Yeah, I don't think Mizora likes that we made this bargain to free him in the first place. She got duped by the loopholes in her own contract, and now she's making sure there's not going to be any more loopholes. Good for her. She would have loved being a lawyer or something. So in my mind, I think it is better for Wyll to sacrifice his father for his freedom. And I do want to say, I came to this conclusion before I realized you could have talked to older Ravengard at Gortash's inauguration, and before I knew about the Iron Throne quest. So I made this decision, I came to this conclusion in a playthrough where I never spoke to his father. I thought his father was a great guy, for the most part. I still thought it was weird that he cast him out, but I was willing to give him the benefit of the doubt because I'd never spoken to him, never met him. And it was still a difficult decision to make. It sucks, and I hate that I was the one who had to make that choice instead of telling Wyll that it's up to him. I hate that Wyll has no agency in his quest, unlike Shadowheart, who you can basically leave all of these big decisions up to her. I hate that Wyll has to potentially allow for his father to die just after barely getting him back within his grasp. But Wyll deserves his freedom. Wyll deserves to break free from his pact, free from the manipulation and the terrible treatment, free from Mizora. And yeah, maybe it's easier for me to say this because at the end of the day, it's a game, and I'm not actually making the choice in real life. I'm not sacrificing my own parents or my friends' parents for their freedom. I'm aware of that. I'm so aware that in real life, this choice would be much more difficult to make, and I think a lot of us, if we had good relationships with our parents, would not make this choice. However, it does become a moot point when you realize you can still save Wyll's father from the Iron Throne despite sacrificing him for freedom. You can have it both ways. I'll be honest, I never organically found this out in-game. I'm pretty sure the game was designed for you to not really do this. I found out about it through a friend and then stumbled my way through some clues from said friend and a separate side quest until I figured out how to save older Ravengard. It's my understanding that there is no way to find clues to figure out how to save him unless you make the deal with Mizora. At least, there's no clues to getting there in a way that's related to saving him. You have to stumble into it on accident. Technically, doing the quest for the Water Queen will lead you to saving older Ravengard. It just would have been cool to have saving his father, despite not working with Mizora, be tied to Wyll's questline, but hey, I'm not going to complain. When you do show up to save older Ravengard after choosing to sacrifice him, Mizora will also show up, sick some spiders on you, and leave. It's low-key underwhelming, but I appreciate that she doesn't make it impossible because the Iron Throne quest is difficult enough, especially if you're actually trying to save all the Gondians. And Mizora also just still hangs out at camp, and when you're not in the Elfsong Tavern, she and Wyll's father are just standing right next to each other outside of Wyll's tent, so like, that's kind of awkward. Kind of funny. After saving Wyll's father, he is kind of a dickhead.
Father. Wyll. Gods, it pains me to look at you. By Baldur's graces, why have the hells ordained you to save me?
Showing disgust towards his son, and seemingly upset to see Wyll, it almost makes me regret saving him. Almost. I know he's very important to Wyll. I'll put up with it. Now, maybe it's because I play D&D in the bard way. I was not aware that warlocks were just not respected, I guess. On the one hand, I do understand why Older Ravengard is upset that his son sold his soul. It's a terrible fate for your child to go through, and most parents do not want to see their children make mistakes, make decisions that's going to cause them to suffer. So I do understand the disgust for the situation. However, I do believe it's unfair that Older Ravengard, without knowing the situation, places all of that blame onto Wyll instead of the devil. Wyll says that he and his father were close. So you would imagine that if you spent 17 years raising someone and you were presumably close with them, you would have a pretty good idea of what lies in their heart, right? Especially Wyll, who carries his heart on his sleeve, more or less. You would think his father would know that Wyll wouldn't just sell his soul for the greed of power. Like, there had to be a reason, right? Right? Like, have some faith in your son, maybe? I mean, to his defense, Mizora did make it pretty much impossible for Wyll to explain what happened and why he needed to sell his soul. And in his father's eyes, he just came home one day and there Wyll was, with a devil at his side. And I can see how that's not particularly great, and it's definitely not great for your image as a politician. But it's so incredibly shitty to cast your kid out for that, and then to meet them with, like, disgust. But you know what? Fine, sure. If Wyll is going to let this slide, then who am I to drag his father to hell for it, you know? But you can see why I don't like Older Ravengard. You are able to make him see reason, though. Wyll can share the truth of what happened to him, and you can share how much of a hero and a good man Wyll has become. And his father comes around. It's resolved super quickly, and Wyll is more than happy to have his father back in his life, even if there are some complicated emotions he must reckon with. It's not really expanded upon, but Wyll does briefly mention these complicated feelings and how he doesn't really know how to feel, but after some words of encouragement, he seems to just slide right by him, maybe even ignore him. Or maybe the words of encouragement were enough for him to reconcile with that. It's a lot of Wyll's character stuff is very much kind of just zoomed right past in this sort of way. I do think it's important to mention that I have never let Wyll stay in his pact to save his father, so I'm not really sure how that plays out. But I would imagine that saving Older Ravengard and the conversations that came after it would play out fairly similarly, just minus the Mizora spiders and probably, hopefully, a line or two about him still being stuck in the pact. I've heard people say that it's kind of the same, though. I can say, though, if you didn't know that you could still save Older Ravengard, after you kill Gortash and lose the opportunity to do the Iron Throne quest, Wyll will come to you in mourning, acknowledging that his father is now dead. It's with a heavy heart that Wyll enters his newfound freedom. It's not a sacrifice he was happy to make, and I do believe that if the choice was left up to him, he would have not chosen to let his father die to become free. Even Astarion and some of the other companions express shock that Wyll did that. Mizora seems to be somewhat proud and also shocked that Wyll makes this decision, or you push him into this decision. Wyll is self-sacrificial to a fault, all for the sake of helping others. Wyll does not showcase many moments of low self-esteem, but with his outlook on heroism and his own duty to protect others, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say he likely believes that his life is not valuable. He does what he can to make the world a better place, but his life is not worth more than anyone else's. In fact, he does not value his life as much as he values the lives of those he seeks to protect. And it's this read on his character that makes me believe so strongly that if it were up to him, Wyll would not allow his father to die. He would doom himself to an eternity tied to Mizora because that means saving someone that's in need of saving. He's not going to let people suffer if he can do something about it, even if that means dooming himself. Even if you save older Ravengard, Mizora will still spread rumors that Wyll caused his death if you choose to be free from the pact. And that causes a bit of a confrontation in the city with some Flaming Fist members, people who I think knew Wyll before he was cast out. Luckily though, Wyll is easily able to talk his way through it, and the Fists remember, oh yeah, I can't trust Mizora. Okay. This encounter shows how Mizora was not going to just let Wyll go, and was going to cause as many problems as possible, like a petty ex or a sadist who enjoys watching people suffer. However, this encounter is also how we learn of the dragon that lays under the city, a last-ditch effort trump card if Baldur's Gate were to ever be in dire trouble. You do learn about this from older Ravengard directly if you save him, and if you save him after freeing Wyll from the contract, then you basically get both cutscenes about it, which I thought was kind of funny. I do find it really fun, though, that Wyll, a character straight out of a fairy tale, has a fairy tale to follow to finish his character arc. I know this quest has been demoted to a side quest no longer tied into Wyll's personal quest, but it is still a huge deal to his character arc, the overarching journey that his character goes on, so I'm going to talk about it here. Using the details of the legend and exploring the areas around Wyrm's Crossing, you're able to find a secret passage located within the prison. And deep underground, you'll find 4 trials meant to test a person's abilities in regards to being a worthy hero. It's a quest to prove oneself, a quest for Wyll to prove to himself that he is a hero. A noble and worthy hero at that. Wyll is a young man destined to be a hero. Wyll is a young man who's carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. Wyll, the Blade of Frontiers. Wyll, the son of former Archduke Ravengard. The whole party, mostly the player, is being tested here, but it is Wyll that really takes this experience to heart. I'm not really going to focus on the puzzles here, but they are fun, and Wyll does have some dialogue here and there that shows his kind heart, specifically with the puzzle in regards to serving justice.
Justice. No pardon without repentance, and no penalty without mercy. The right path often lies between the extremes.
Fair.
Mercy, please. Justice should be a harsh lesson. All the better to deter the next vagabond.
I can't agree with Baby Girl on that. Astarion, there's like a whole anime series about why that's a terrible idea. After passing all of the tests, you're able to head down deeper where the dragon is supposedly laying in wait. But there is no dragon. There's just the carcass of a creature who was killed an unspecified number of years ago. Wyll is incredibly disappointed and upset about this. The saving grace that helped defend the city against the Absolute is not here. There's no dragon, there's no greater being that we can depend on to help us defeat the Absolute. There's nothing. After a little bit of self-pity, the Emperor is able to give us some words of wisdom.
You braved the Wyrm's lair, seeking a savior. Yet it was you, all of you, who vanquished the undead abomination which Unsur became. You are more powerful than you understand.
All without
It
the
is you
Illithid
who
magic
are the
too.
Tempest.
Fuck this guy.
It is you who are the heart of the gate.
I have not slurped up a single pole.
You're right. We are the warriors who'll slay the Absolute. We are the guardians who'll defend this fair city.
Wyll's on the right path. And it's the biggest takeaway from this whole experience. The strength and power laid within us the whole time. Wyll carried the ability to save the world. Wyll is the noble and just hero all along, and he didn't need a series of tests and a dragon on his side to prove that. Wyll is more than capable. He's already a hero. thinking about his future, Wyll does toy with the idea of replacing his father in the political scene of Baldur's Gate, helping people through policy and being a figurehead. And you can support him in this decision, or you can tell him to follow his heart. In every playthrough I've done, Wyll has always chosen not to pursue politics. I do always tell him to follow his heart. It is the only decision that I can leave up to him. And with a newfound confidence, Wyll declares himself the Blade of Avernus, devoting himself to slaying devils who seek to do harm, helping people more directly, getting them out of danger's way.
What good is a champion who puts himself above the people? What good am I as a politician just out of reach?
Real.
There
So
will be
real.
no Grand Duke Wyll Ravengard, and there will be no Blade of Frontiers. I am now the Blade of Avernus.
All right.
For as long as demons
Nice.
and devils imperil the Sword Coast, they will be my prey.
So real for that, bestie. Hail the Blade of Avernus.
Blade of Avernus.
A calm settles over you. The Elder Brain is a menace, but with the Blade of Avernus at your side, you know you will triumph.
Honestly, this to me feels more in character for him. It's how he's been helping people for the past 7 years, and he knows that that's effective and definitely needed. But it also feels like he's mad about Mizora. He is rightfully upset about what has happened to him and the way that she treated him. The way that he's been placed in these impossible decisions because of her. Wyll's newfound goals, though, do seemingly come out of nowhere. If you let him seek out politics, there has been no interest on his part in this kind of life or work. I get that it's supposed to be him seeking to follow in his father's footsteps, continuing the Ravengard legacy, and perhaps seeking to feel closer to his father, but there's not a single bit of build-up to this decision. Alternatively, where did the desire to fight the Hells come from? Like, yeah, that's probably his anger towards Mizora, his sympathy and anger for what happened to our dear friend Karlach. But again, it seemingly comes out of nowhere. No build-up, no conversations that start to bring up these options before the decisions are made. And I don't think I've missed anything because I've had Wyll on my party a lot in multiple playthroughs. At least with a lot of the other characters, there's a little bit of build-up that, hey, we're about to do like some life-changing decisions, or hey, I'm playing with the idea of becoming a god or becoming the vampire ascendant. There's build-up. It doesn't just become sprung on you out of nowhere. I mean, the choices do make sense for Wyll's character. I just wish it was expanded upon, built up, incorporated into the narrative. I don't believe there's an inherently wrong choice to make here either, but I do think the fact that he seems to reject politics when you urge him to follow his heart shows where he would really be happy. On the front lines, directly helping those in need. And if that's not the most on-brand thing for Wyll, then I don't know what is. I do think it's kind of interesting, though, that Wyll doesn't necessarily have a bad end, at least in regards to the future he's picking for himself. If anything, his bad end would be staying tied to Mizora, but then he still gets his father back. So there's arguments to be made for all of Wyll's endings, that they're all like equally fine. He doesn't have an ending that feels as bad as some of the other characters who have very blatant and obvious bad endings where they're perpetuating the cycles of abuse. With Wyll, it's either I help people in a different way, I help people, but I'm still stuck in a pact with a demon, which is probably the worst option, but it's still not as drastic, I guess is what I'm trying to say. He doesn't have as dramatic of a difference in his endings. And also there's the argument that if he stays in the pact with Mizora, he does still get to reconnect with his father, which is something that's very important for him. So it's kind of like the decision between letting Shadowheart sacrifice her parents to be completely free of Shar, or staying tied to Shar through the wound on her hand, but also getting to have her parents. Those are both good ends for her. So in comparison, you can see why I would think that Wyll doesn't have like a bad end, even though staying with Mizora would be his bad end. Speaking of the future, though, if you're romancing Wyll, he does have a romance finale in Act 3, a whimsical date where he proposes to you. It's really cute and just drives home how much of a fairy tale romantic he is, but beyond that, there's not a whole lot to say about it. I'll just show you some clips.
The Wilden Oak. Legend has it stood since the Age of Dawn. I used to come here and climb it when my father's eye was turned elsewhere. Daydream of the stories it might tell if I listened close enough. The dragon lords sparking the skies above it. The moon elves first plucking the strings of the weave. Standing here, I feel like I can see into forever.
That's so cute. Okay, enjoy the view, enjoy Wyll's quiet company, beautiful story. That's a beautiful story. I'm glad you told it to me.
I was hoping you'd think so. I've been thinking a lot about forever. More so, I've been thinking about everything that comes before, and who I want at my side as it passes.
This
My
is
mother
so
always
cute.
said the Wilden Oak's acorns held just a touch of wishing magic. If that be so, then may my greatest wish come true tonight. I love you. Will you be mine today
This
and
is so
tomorrow
cute.
and reaching into eternity?
This is so cute and whimsical. Oh my god. I love this. We're gonna take the acorn and nod. That's so
Your
fun.
skin flushes and your soul sings as you palm the acorn, wishing magic, affection, love. Whatever the cause, it's as real as the ground beneath you.
When I romanced Astarion, it was fun in the sense that I learned that I can love people, in the sense that I've been grappling with whether or not I'm aromantic for the past few years. But romancing Wyll was a lot of me realizing that I could be loved. And I love that for me. Wyll's romance was such a good, fun time. Even if it's not as fleshed out or as much content as the other companions, the little bit that we do have is just so whimsical and sweet and wholesome and just such a good time. I felt like I was watching a really fun shoujo romance, and I have fun with that. I enjoy it. So I really like Wyll's romance, even though it doesn't change a lot for his character. It doesn't add too much. I still wanted to bring it up. But with that, though, Wyll is doing his best to defeat the Absolute, with you by his side, romanced or not. After saving Baldur's Gate, the Sword Coast, all of Faerun from the Netherbrain, the Blade of Avernus can accompany Karlach back to Hell, where the two of them fight to take down devils and fix Karlach's heart. And you can choose to go with them, whether you're romancing either of them or not. I'll be honest, I have not seen any other ending for Wyll personally. I always let him take Karlach to Avernus because that's how you get the good ending for Karlach. And it's a pretty good ending for Wyll as well. I imagine, though, if he chose to follow in his father's footsteps, he'd stay and help rebuild Baldur's Gate, either taking his place as the new Archduke, now that older Ravengard is dead, and also Gortash, or working with his father to help those in the city. At the epilogue party, if Wyll went to Avernus with Karlach, he seems genuinely happy with what he's doing. If you didn't romance Wyll or Karlach, they seem to be much closer and potentially in love with one another, which I love for them. But if you did romance Wyll, you were a part of the Avernus gang, fighting your way through hell alongside them, and you're all grateful to be back and seeing old friends. And Wyll also blows you this really cute kiss when you go to talk to him. It's a cute time. Although I do think this plays out the same whether you romanced him or not, the only difference being the little cheesy cute kiss. However, if Wyll becomes a duke, the two of you will be married and maybe already have a child, but the details of your lives together are pretty sparse with every ending. which is a bit odd considering how well fleshed out some of the other companion endings are, but that may be due to the other companions having a more fleshed out and consistent storyline. Unfortunately, while Wyll's story is still very much about the cycles of abuse, the way every character in this game is, it's not expanded upon in the same ways as everyone else. He never has the opportunity to stand up to those who have unjustly wronged him. At most, the player can negotiate for him to get out of his contract and then figure out how to save Wyll's dad from the Iron Throne, despite Mizora's interference. When it comes to Mizora, Wyll's story matches Shadowheart in a sense. At most, he can separate himself from her, much as Shadowheart has the opportunity to separate herself from Shar, but both characters are asked to sacrifice their parents in the process of separating themselves from the powerful being that chains them. However, Wyll's father is not the ideal parent figure either. He's not as good of a parent as Shadowheart's parents seem to be. This man cast out his 17-year-old child for pretty much no reason, other than the fact that this kid for some reason made a deal with the devil. I understand Wyll Ravengard disowned Wyll because it was some stain on him and looked bad for him to parade around a son who was tainted by the hells pretty much. It's politics. Politics bullshit, really. But that still feels cruel and unnecessary to me. And yes, you can make the argument that it was just very much morally wrong to deal with Mizora, and so Wyll got kicked out because it would be the equivalent of a parent kicking out a child who engaged in dangerous activity and was becoming a danger to the household. But that's still not what that child needs in that moment. But Wyll is nothing but understanding and forgiving of his father. He's more than happy to reconnect and consider the past 7 years water under the bridge for the sake of having his father around again. Having his father finally understand what happened. And on the one hand, I do understand. Wyll still cares very deeply for his father despite everything. I just have a hard time looking past how Wyll's father treats him before he gets the full story. Maybe it's because I have parents that are a little bit more understanding than older Ravengard, so I know it can be different and it can be better. It also just irks me because I feel like if older Ravengard knew Wyll, it would be wild to believe that Wyll would just make these heavy decisions, sacrificing himself for no good reason. Like, did this man just not know his own son? Or was he just an asshole who refused to understand that sometimes there are desperate situations that the ends will justify the means? Yes, I understand that older Ravengard did not know why Wyll made the contract at the time, and when he does learn, he is very apologetic and accepting. Maybe it's because I don't live in a world where people sell their souls to devils. So maybe this is a misunderstanding on my part. Warlocks are not real, at least not in the world that I live in. So maybe it's just hard for me to understand what older Ravengard was going through because the situation is so fantasy based that it's just so separated from anything I've ever thought about experiencing in my life. And maybe I also just misunderstand the gravity of being a warlock within D&D. I am fully able to admit that I don't know a whole lot about being anything other than a bard. So, I am willing to admit that maybe I'm being unfairly harsh towards Wyll's father because there's some sort of cultural understanding that I just lack here. So, maybe it's that. I feel like he's not particularly a great father, and he's kind of a dick to Wyll in Act 3 until he gets the full story, and that seems not great to me. It works out eventually. It's just crazy to me because I feel like part of having children is loving them unconditionally even when they make mistakes or choices you don't agree with. But it's whatever. Wyll's story diverges from the typical cycles of abuse theme that Baldur's Gate 3 has, and focuses more on helping those around him, saving them from the absolute cult and all that. There's more of a focus on him becoming palatable again for his father, or falling victim to Mizora's gains, maximizing his suffering. Wyll does not get to go on a journey of healing and finding the power in love the way that the other companions do. It's a well-known thing amongst Wyll enjoyers that his character has consistently gotten the short end of the stick. Last-minute character rewrites, internalized racism that needs to be unpacked and overcome, and a lot of favoritism towards the characters that seem to bring the most interactions online. I know I'm a part of the problem as an Astarion lover, but I don't have anything new to add to these conversations. It just is unfortunately a very important factor into Wyll's character and his writing and everything about Wyll in the game, so we'll leave it at that. As a character though, Wyll's entire thing seems to be asking the questions of what does it take to be a hero and what's the price of freedom. Both have required a great deal of sacrifice on Wyll's part, and while he may say sacrificing himself to save others was an easy choice to make, I don't think it was actually that easy. Wyll is selfless, to a fault even, and I do believe he didn't have a hard time deciding to sell his soul to protect his home, but that doesn't mean that it was an easy decision. He just felt the consequences were worth it. The ends justified the means for him. For Wyll, being able to be a hero is worth everything, but freedom? Freedom isn't as easy to bargain for in his eyes, at least when it comes to his own freedom. It's with a heavy heart and an unsure mind that Wyll decides to sacrifice his father for the sake of getting his life back from Mizora. It's a choice he actually doesn't even make at all, but the player pushes him into making. I know I said this earlier, but I really, really wish Wyll had more agency in his story. Almost every major decision regarding him in this game are all decided by the player. There's no persuasion, no option to see what Wyll wants, no option to let him handle things. The only thing he decides for himself is whether or not he wants a life in politics. But the decision to bargain with Mizora, that was my cocky ass. The decision to sacrifice his father, that fell to my selfish self. I really wish we had a concrete way of knowing what Wyll would do in those situations if he wasn't being strong-armed by the player. At most, we can only speculate, and what I've seen of Wyll's character tells me that he values protecting others over saving himself. For Wyll, being a hero, protecting those in need is everything to him. It's worth everything. And if the price of saving an entire city is just one measly little soul, then that's a bargain he'd take again and again. Wyll doesn't really grow past that. For the most part, his character is pretty stagnant throughout the game, unless you press and persuade him to give in to power and consume tadpoles and not care about the consequences, but you can do that with every companion, so I don't think it's a very important aspect to dwell on and unpack here. Wyll's values are not challenged. His worldview is more or less affirmed, and he continues to do what he can to help others. It's what he's always done. Wyll's character arc is not centered around unlearning and overcoming abuse. There's no healing journey for him. He's just a guy who carries the world on his shoulders and ignores the ways in which he has been wronged because his own personal struggles are not that important to himself. Wow, that sucks for him. I hope he learns to treat himself with the same level of kindness and grace that he treats everyone else with. He deserves it, honestly. I am aware that some of my interpretation of his character is just due to lack of depth and content surrounding him, but hey, all I can do is look at what we do have and do my best to fill in the gaps. And right now, that's the whole picture I see when looking at Wyll Ravengard. And in case this needed to be said, because I feel like this needs to be said, this is just my interpretation of the character, and I am sure we all have different takeaways when playing this game. All I can do is look at what the game has given me and try to piece the puzzle together. And that may look different for you guys or someone else. Anyway, I think we've thoroughly unpacked Wyll Ravengard. I'm genuinely surprised that this script was able to be as long as all the others just because he has so much less content. But I really like Wyll, so I'm glad I was able to yap for an equal amount of time with him. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching my Wyll video. I will see you all in the next one, whatever that may be. Bye!